I'm Mike Smith, the Elaine and Graham Landau archivist for the Detroit Jewish News, and we are really pleased, thrilled to have Dr. Melissa Klapper here today to discuss the Civil War diary of Emma Mordecai, which she co-edited with Diane Ashton, and she'll give you the full story of how they picked this diary and decided to edit it. So I'm going to preface our remarks today with just a couple points about the American Civil War. It's been this American Civil War entered 160 years ago this year in 1865. The war was waged from 1861 to 1865. And it was an extremely traumatic affair for America. One would be hard pressed at that era, at that time, to find a family that did not have husbands or sons or cousins or nephews serving in either the Union or Confederate Army, and therefore extended families. You would be hard pressed to find a family that did not suffer the loss of one of these men or witness them return with horrific injuries. Women were also deeply affected by the war, whether tending to wounded soldiers or as members of various organizations that supported the Army with medical supplies, bandages, blankets, clothing, and food, or those left behind to maintain family households, family farms, in the absence of husbands and fathers. To say nothing of women who were near or on the battlefields as the war raged. When the war ended, over an estimated 600,000 Americans were killed in action. Millions had been wounded. And by the way, that amount of killed in action is more than the American Revolution, the War of 1812, World War I, World War II, and the Korean War combined. It should be noted also that American Jews at this time were less than 1% of the total population, even less in the South. But they participated in every aspect of the war, including as soldiers. Our author today, Dr. Melissa Klapper, will give us some serious insight into women in the Civil War, and in particular, one Jewish woman from the South, Emma Mordecai. Melissa is a professor of history and the director of women and gender studies at Rowan University in Glassboro, New Jersey. She's the author of numerous books and articles on the subjects of American Jewish women's history, the history of American childhood, and the history of American childhood, Her books include Ballots, Babies, Banners of Peace, American Jewish Women's Activism, 1890 to 1940. This book, by the way, won the prestigious National Jewish Book Award in Women's Studies. She also did ballet class in American history, and with Diane Ashton, the Civil War diary of Emma Mordecai that we're going to discuss today. Melissa's work has been awarded many grants and fellowships, and she lectures frequently in academic and community venues. And now she's making her debut at the Detroit Jewish News Club. We're so happy to have you, Melissa, and thanks for speaking to us today. And I'll start with the question and turn it over to you and shut up. So perhaps we should begin with the discovery of the diary. I realize it's not technically a lost item that someone found under the bed or buried in the backyard, but as an archivist, I know when you have huge collections, there are hidden gems in the collections, and you await the day that a historian or an author discovers the piece and decides to write about it. So what can you tell us about Diane Ashton's discovery and quest to edit and publish the diary of Emma Mordecai?
Well, good morning, everybody. So pleased to be with you, albeit virtually. So let me just start a couple things, but I want to just start off with. One is that despite the fact that, a Jewish audience in particular might look at Emma Mordecai's name and say that you pronounce it Mordecai, in fact, the family pronounced it Mordecai, and that's what you will hear me saying. At some point, they decided that's how to pronounce the family name, and so we will honor that. So I also want to say that this project was not originally mine. My senior colleague, Diane Ashton, who passed away, unfortunately, in January of 2022, had for a long time been interested in Jewish women in the Civil War. There was some limited scholarship about that, including one book by Jennifer Stolman about Jewish women in the Civil War. And Diane Ashton also knew about Emma Mordecai. The Mordecai family was one of the most famous, well-known Southern Jewish families in the antebellum era. And Diane also knew that Emma Mordecai kept a diary during the last year or so of the Civil War. This was known to scholars. Other people have written a little bit about this diary. If you read the books that are about Richmond, in particular, Richmond, Virginia, and the fall of Richmond, they use Emma Mordecai's diary as a source. There's a book about siblings in the Civil War that talk about the Mordecai family for reasons I'll explain in a moment. So, as Mike said, the diary was not totally unknown. It lives at the in the Mordecai family papers that are kept at the Southern Historical Collection at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. It is an absolutely enormous collection. I don't think anybody has been through all of it, and that includes Diane Ashton. But the diary was, the point is that it was known, but nobody had ever published the full diary and made it available to the public. And no one had ever written sort of a full accounting of the life of Emma, who kept this diary from April of 1864 to May of 1865. So it's not exactly a discovery, but Diane Ashton was very interested in bringing the full diary to the public in this way by publishing it. So Diane and I were colleagues at Rowan University. She was a generation or so, more than that really, closer to my mother's age actually, ahead of me academically. She was a real feminist pioneer in religious studies. She had a degree, a PhD from Temple University, which was sort of the bastion of feminist religious studies scholarship in the 70s. She spent 38 years at Rowan, so she was already there when I arrived at Rowan in 2001. We were not in the same department. She was a religious studies person, and I'm in the history department. But I already knew her from Jewish studies conferences and from a similar interest and overlapping interests in American Jewish women's history. So at Rowan, she was first my mentor and then my colleague and my friend. We read each other's work. We always knew what the other person was working on. So I did know at the time of her passing away that she was working on this project about Emma Mordecai. And actually, she had been working on it for about 10 years. She had a chronic illness and had been slowed down considerably. And I just couldn't stand the idea that after 10 years of work, this project would just disappear into the ether. And so I approached her husband, whom I knew socially and through Diane, to ask if he would be, what he thought about my picking up this project and trying to finish it in Diane's name. And we agreed that, assuming a bunch of other things fell into place, I would do that. So it's just important to me to start off by talking about how this was Diane's project initially. And this diary, she just felt that it was really, there are a few other Civil War Jewish women's diaries, including a few from the South. And each of them is a very different experience. There's an adolescent girl who kept a diary for a year and a half or so in New Orleans, an adolescent Jewish girl. There's another younger woman in her 20s who kept a diary in Charleston. There was another woman who, like Emma, worked in hospitals in Richmond, although she was actually professionally engaged to work in hospitals. So we do actually have a few other Jewish women's diaries, but Emma is unique in a lot of ways, as are all diaries. And so Diane just thought bringing this to the public was really important, and an important way to talk about the complications of Jewish identity in the South in general, before and during the Civil War, but particularly for this American Jewish woman in the South, who was from a family that very largely supported the Confederacy. The Mordecai family had been in the South for a generation or so. Emma grew up on a farm outside of Richmond and then moved to Richmond as an adolescent, so she spent most of her life there. At the time the diary began, she was in her 50s. She was a middle-aged, unmarried woman. That meant she couldn't live alone. No respectable woman, North, South, West, lived alone in this period, so she had always lived with family. And at the time the diary picks up, in April 1864, there had been a huge change in her life. For a long time, she had lived with her mother, who was in her 90s when she died, very unusual during this period, particularly for a woman who had a lot of children. And Emma had lived with her mother and two of her older half-siblings in a house in Richmond. And in April, after her mother died about 6 months earlier, Emma and her two siblings decided it was just getting too dangerous to stay in Richmond. As the capital of the Confederacy, it was clearly a place that was going to get invaded and bombed again, as it already had been earlier in the war, and they just thought it was time to get out of Dodge. So the three siblings went different places, and Emma went to her non-Jewish sister-in-law's home, which was a farm about 5 miles away from Richmond. This was a sister-in-law who'd been married to her brother Augustus, one of Emma's favorite siblings. Emma was one of 13 children, so there were a lot of siblings. And she knew the whole household very well. She knew her sister-in-law Rosina. She knew her 3 nephews, all of whom who were fighting for the Confederacy. She knew her young niece, Augusta, named for her late brother. And she also knew all the enslaved members of the household, and we'll come back to this, but she and Rosina and the whole Mordecai family really considered the enslaved people members of the family. As we will see, that was not necessarily reciprocated, but Emma was not moving to a place where she didn't know anyone or that was unfamiliar to her. But when the diary started because of this major change in her life circumstances. She was leaving Richmond, she was leaving living with family, she was leaving being the mistress of her household, she had run the household, and she was going to live somewhere else and to a non-Jewish home. Many of her siblings had either converted or married non-Jewish spouses. So for all these reasons, this was a huge, huge change in her life. And Diane and I both believed that that was why she started to keep the diary when she did, and not throughout the entire war. So that's just by way of a basic sort of introduction to this project. And like I said, I got involved with it after Diane passed away. I had not read her manuscript in progress. I didn't realize until after Diane passed away that instead of writing a full biography of Emma Mordecai, instead she had decided to write a long scholarly introduction to the book, scholarly but extremely readable. I hope that some of you have picked up the book already know that. And then to present the diary in full. And so that was the format she wanted. I honored those wishes. That's the way the book is structured now. It's about a third introduction and about 2/3 of the diary. And Diane also had, as she was working on it, she had decided not to annotate the diary itself, but to provide all the necessary information to read it, the who's who, the what's where, all of that in the introduction. And so I honored that preference too. Diane was a consummate professional. She had written a number of wonderful books, including a fantastic history of Hanukkah that I really recommend to you all, a biography of Rebecca Gratz, who was another very significant American Jewish woman in the antebellum period. And she knew how to write a good book, but she hadn't been able to give this one her full attention. And so the manuscript needed quite a bit of work, and that's sort of where I came in and worked on it to make it publishable. And both Diane and I had a relationship with New York University Press that had published her most recent book and several of my books. And so I took it there, and they were really good partners in this somewhat unusual publication.
Well, first I'll say personally, and I'll probably speak for most of our readers, it's a big mitzvah that you did to pick up this project and run with it as a tribute to your colleague and friend, but it's a great thing. So, you've mentioned a number of things, blown a couple of my questions, by the way. But what I'd like to know at this point is, you've mentioned this diary, why it's so special. What do you think of Emma Mordecai? I mean, you have a Southern woman who's supporting the Confederacy, never really disillusioned, it seemed to me. What do you think of her and her role in the war?
So Emma Mordecai is a very complex figure, something that you need to know going in, right? Here she is. She's this Jewish woman. There were about 25,000 Jews in the Confederacy before the Civil War. It's a very small population. There was a decent-sized Jewish community in Richmond, and Richmond actually had one of the oldest synagogues in the country. But at the time that Emma was living there, at the time of the Civil War, there were 2 synagogues, one that used the Ashkenazi ritual and one the Sephardi ritual, which is the one Emma went to. She was very much a daughter of the South. She believed in the Confederacy. She was a staunch Confederate nationalist. She really, had been converted to the cause. She didn't even need to be converted. She believed in the South. She believed and what that really meant was that she believed in slavery. She believed that slavery was a beneficent good, that it was good not only for white people, but also for African Americans who, by her understanding, by her reckoning, were enfeebled and childlike and unable to take care of themselves, so they needed to be taken care of. She and Rosina both, and many of the Mordecais, but especially Emma and Rosina, really prided themselves on being, I'm going to put this in quotes, good slave owners, in the sense that they weren't violent. They thought that was terrible. They didn't separate families. Rosina in particular, almost all the enslaved people who lived on the farm that Emma went to live on Rosina's farm, were almost all members of the same family. There were actually three generations. Sarah and Cyrus, the eldest enslaved people who, although not legally married because that was not allowed in Virginia at the time, were effectively married. Several of their children and some of their children-in-law and grandchildren. And Rosina had made a promise that she would never sell or separate them, and she kept that promise. Emma had, in fact, earlier in her life, sold an enslaved person that was making her unhappy, and she sold that person actually to her brother George, who had a very large plantation. He had married a wealthy North Carolina woman, and they had the kind of plantation you see in Gone with the Wind, huge manor house, hundreds of enslaved people. And being sold to an outfit like that was not what any enslaved person would want, even within the horrible system of slavery. And Emma did sell one of the people she owned to her brother George. But at this period of her life, she's focused on being good to the people she owned. And she believed in it. She really believed in the system. That is evident throughout the diary. She and all of her siblings, except for one, were in fact ardent Confederate nationalists. A number of her siblings had already passed away before the war started, but all her nieces and nephews and their children, everybody in the Mordecai family was a staunch Confederate nationalist. Many members of the family fought in the Civil War on the side of the Confederates, except for one brother named Alfred, who had actually gone to West Point and was a career military officer for the U.S. Army. And when the war broke out, he, like many Southern soldiers, like Robert E. Lee, who also went to West Point and were career military officers, had to decide which side were they going to fight for. Famously, as you all know, of course, Robert E. Lee resigned his commission in the U.S. Army and went to become a general for the Confederacy. Alfred actually did not do that. He just resigned his commission, and he said he wasn't going to go, be a traitor, basically, and join the Confederacy, but he also didn't want to stay in the Army and fight all these people that he knew, that he had been to school with, that he had served with, and all these family members. So he retired to civilian life in Philadelphia throughout the war. He and his wife, Sally, or Sarah, who was related to Rebecca Gratz, actually, had never owned enslaved people, although they had hired out African-American people to work for them. And they just were out of touch with the rest of the family throughout the Civil War. So even within this large, very Confederate family, there were these divisions and fissures. And Emma and many of her siblings were very angry at Alfred for not coming to join them. They were really angry about it, and they just had no contact with him during the war. So it's this complex situation, because here we have this ardent Confederate nationalist, and she's racist. There's no two ways about it. She is also a staunch defender of Judaism. Unlike many of her siblings, she never considered for a minute converting. She did actually consider for a minute marrying out. As a much younger woman, she was briefly engaged to a non-Jewish man. And although she didn't marry him, ironically, the brother who sort of put the kibosh on that engagement then himself went off and married a non-Jewish woman. So it's a complicated family. But Emma really devoutly believed in Judaism. She founded the first Jewish Sunday school in Richmond. She wrote a textbook for that school. She was always at the synagogue. When she moved to the farm, to her sister-in-law's farm, she went back to Richmond for almost all the Jewish holidays and spent them in a Jewish space with her relatives and went to synagogue services. She was a very staunch defender of Judaism. And yet she's a Confederate nationalist and a slave owner, and an unrepentant slave owner. And so she's a very complicated person. And I think one of the things we learn from reading her diary is how messy history is. And there are other complicated people in her family. It's a very interesting family. But this is another reason why I think Diane Ashton wanted to bring this book to light, to publish her diary, to demonstrate how complicated history is and how contradictory, people, as Walt Whitman said, people contain multitudes. And Emma is a very good example of that.
Yeah. Briefly, but one of the things you alluded to, which our members might be interested in, is the affinity people had for their states at that time. That was much stronger, I think, than today. Like Robert E. Lee couldn't go against Virginia. Maybe you could just say a brief thing about that, or your sense of it, if I am accurate.
I mean, so clearly there was a national identity, but the United States was not, as a country, was not even 100 years old at the time of the Civil War. And a lot of people really did prioritize their state. That's how they felt like they were sort of citizens of Virginia, particularly in the South. That was actually a little less true in the North and in the Midwest, or the far West even, but people really felt that they belonged to their state. And this goes way back, all the way back to the Constitution and states' rights issues and trying to balance what the federal government could do with what the state government could do. And the Civil War, in fact, is about slavery, but slavery is seen through the prism of states' rights. I want to be very clear. When you hear people today say that the Civil War is about states' rights, they are trying to obscure a history. The states' rights that were concerned in the Civil War were about slavery, where slavery could expand, that whether or not the federal government could say new states coming in cannot have slavery or not. States' rights, when people talk about states' rights, that is a very problematic way to think about the Civil War. Those states' rights were about slavery. That is what the Civil War was about. But people did feel very closely connected to their states. Now, many of the Mordecais mostly lived in Virginia and North Carolina. There were some in the South Carolina, there were some in Alabama. All of them joined, sort of their local regiments. That's what you did, right? And that was true in the North too. People joined, the New York regiment number this, or the Pennsylvania regiment number that, or the Michigan number, whatever, for that matter. But they didn't, it was the conflict, especially once President Lincoln was elected in 1860, but did not win the votes of any of the states in the South, that fracture between thinking about states' rights and federal identity became that much stronger. And a lot of people were like, okay, we're just going to go with our state. We're not going to think about the federal government. Now, of course, under the Constitution, that's basically treason, and thus the Civil War. But it is a kind of different affinity, to use Mike's word, about state identity at this time. Particularly Virginia, it particularly had that. Virginia very much felt itself to be, it's one of the original 13 colonies, one of the largest, one of the biggest, one of the most influential. And so Virginians in particular tended to feel that way.
Yeah. My great, 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 great grandfather, somewhere in there, was in the Michigan 22nd Regiment, by the way. Just throw that out there. So you've given us a good portrait of Emma Mordecai, a Jewish woman in the South, as you put it, a woman of the South, a woman of the Confederacy. So what are the commonalities between women in the North during the Civil War and women in the South, and maybe any other disparities you might address?
Okay. So women in both the North and the South, and when we say North, we also really mean, the upper Midwest. I mean, the country did not end, that includes Michigan, for instance, right? When we talk about the North, it includes lots of the whole country as it existed at the time, which certainly extended California as a state. I mean, there were lots of places. There are some commonalities. Women mobilized. The home front had to mobilize. In a civil war, you do not only have the line of fighting, the military front, you also have the home front, and it's equally as important, and sometimes more important, in terms of providing supplies and being able to provide transportation. The South really suffered from its slave economy that had focused almost entirely on agriculture. The South had very little of the infrastructure that you saw in the North and the Midwest. For instance, railroads. Right. From the North, you could get, you could get to Chicago from almost anywhere in the North very easily. There were lots of rail lines. There were canals. There were major roads, right, all of which had been built by both federal and state investment. And in the South, the focus on agriculture didn't necessarily require that. Yes, you needed to be able to get the goods you were producing, cotton in particular, to ports in order to sell it. But there was only one iron works in the entire Confederacy at the time the war started, for instance, and it was near Richmond, which is one of the reasons why Richmond became the capital of the Confederacy. Richmond had the best rail lines and the best transit options, but still, everybody had to sort of participate. So women were making cloth for uniforms. Women were providing all kinds of support to the soldiers, raising money to improve the quality of the food and the clothing and the tents that they had. The federal government couldn't do it all, neither could the Confederate government. women were needed, especially on the home front, to literally hold down the farm while the men were away. And in the South, in particular, really a very significant number of adult men served in the Confederate Army at some point. It's a high number in the North too, but the percentage is higher in the South because there were fewer people in the South to begin with. They needed more people drafted, more men drafted into the Army, and so women were running the show back at home. There is a school of thought in the history of the Civil War that actually says that the reason the Confederacy lost the war is because the women at some point decided that they didn't want to do this anymore, and they especially were not so happy about having to be the people who were keeping the enslaved people in line through violence. That had been very much a gendered male job, and now women had to do it, and they didn't want to, couldn't do it, refused to do it, refused to step out of those gender bounds. I personally am of the opinion that that was a factor. I think it's a mistake to point to any one thing as the factor, the reason why the Confederacy lost, but it certainly does play a role. And so women are doing some of the same things. But in the South, they are needed that much more. They work at hospitals as nurses. There's such a labor shortage because there are fewer people, and because some of the labor in the South is running away during this period, right? As many enslaved people as possible just left as fast as they were able to and went north. There's just a huge labor shortage in the South that is somewhat less in the North. Also because the South had much less immigration during the 1840s and 1850s than the North or the Midwest. So women had to do all kinds of just actual labor that they had never done before. And so there are differences there. Another difference is that women in the South who were involved in all these activities tended to do it in a local way. They weren't really kind of women's groups that operated across the entire Confederacy. Groups of women would do X, Y, and Z in Richmond or in Virginia, but they weren't necessarily in a formal way working with the women in Alabama or the women in South Carolina or Tennessee. Whereas in the North, a lot of women's work was coordinated through something called the United States Sanitary Commission, which is basically an NGO, a non-governmental organization that supported the military and supported the front, but it was much more effective because it was coordinated and because it could use all the transit that was available in the North in a way that was not available in the South. Communication was better in the North, and so women are doing some of the same things, but the structure around a lot of their activities they're different, North and South. Also, I guess I'll just add one more thing, which the other major difference, and this does matter, and it certainly shows up in Emma Mordecai's diary, is that the battles, except for a very few, like the Battle of Gettysburg, famously, the war front, the battlefields were all in the South. And so women like Emma Mordecai might live within earshot of a battlefield, and she did. And throughout her diary, there's references to hearing cannon fire and gunshots. They come across corpses just when taking walks in the woods. I mean, the war is right there in their faces in a way that is not true for women, let's say, who are living in upstate Michigan or any part of Michigan, or Maine, or New York, right? There's just, the war is literally all around them, which also makes it a more dangerous place to live.
Yeah. So do you have a favorite passage in the diary? And I can tell you mine have.
Okay, well, actually, so I'd love to hear yours. My favorite passage, I mean, there's a lot. There's some that I, find very striking, but I hesitate to call them favorite because they're sort of about slavery. But the one I'm just going to read very briefly. This diary entry is from June 10th, 1864. And Emma writes, but at this point, she had already started going to the hospitals to help as a sort of voluntary nurse or nurse's aide. And she writes, I had intended visiting the hospitals today, but on consulting my Hebrew calendar, I found it was the first day of Pentecost at Shavuot, so I remained at home to observe the day as well as I could by reading the services and reminding myself of my peculiar duties as an inheritor of law, given to us by him who said, I, the Lord, changeth not. Blind and foolish are those children of Israel who persuade themselves that the laws given to them by the unchanging one for them and their descendants to observe forever are not binding on them. So to me, this is one of the passages in the book that really illustrates how much Emma's Judaism meant to her. It was something that really mattered to her. She was upset to realize that she had missed a holiday that was coming. As I said, she spent all the other Jewish holidays throughout the course of the diary in Richmond with her family. She had a Hebrew calendar with her. She had a Hebrew Bible with her. She had a prayer book with her. She used them every weekend, every Shabbat. And this idea that, you don't really have a choice, but that Judaism is a wonderful thing to be part of this community, to be part of this faith. And when she says that, blind and foolish are those who have turned away from it, she's talking about her close family members. A number of her siblings, as I mentioned, either converted or married out. And so to her, like this had been a point of contention between her, within her relationship with some of her siblings, but she's just really devoted. And it also demonstrates something that Diane Ashton noticed in her diary, that an insight that I think is so interesting, which is that the diary basically functioned as Emma's Jewish space while she was living in this non-Jewish household. Emma loved her sister-in-law. They most of the time got along really well. She loved her nephews, and she really adored her niece. She was like another mother to her niece. She had more or less friendly relationships, or so she thought, with the enslaved people, but this wasn't her house, and it wasn't Jewish. She left a home that almost certainly had a mezuzah on the door, where if they didn't exactly keep strictly kosher, they certainly observed the basic dietary laws. And now she's in a space where, she's keeping the Sabbath on her own. Nobody minds it. Nobody's giving her any trouble, but she's in a Christian household. And so she uses the diary as a Jewish space. There's many, many entries with prayers, with addresses to God, with talk of Judaism, with talk of Jewish soldiers in the Confederacy that she hears about. She really keeps track of her Jewish religious and spiritual life in the diary. And what Diane noticed was that whenever Emma went to Richmond to spend time staying with her Jewish cousins and doing Jewish things, she actually didn't take the diary with her. She didn't need it there. She didn't, there she was living in a Jewish space. And so I've just found that really fascinating, and this entry is an example of that. But I'm curious to hear what your favorite entry is, Mike.
First of all, I thought it was a great diary. One of my, if you forgive me a couple of minutes of myself, but for 5 years, I collected historical records for the Bentley Historical Library at Michigan. The whole state was my playground. And I was often offered diaries. One in particular, a whole set of diaries from Port Huron from around 1900 to 1915. At first, I thought, wonderful, wonderful. Then I started looking through them. The day I had peas and, beef for lunch. The weather's nice today. And it continued like that in about 24 little diaries. The reason I say this is that I really found Emma Mordecai, also, by the way, I've mispronounced it a couple times, and my helpful staff slipped this in the door to remind me it's Mordecai, and they're not my staff, the people, my colleagues. Anyway, the diary is so insightful, and to my favorite passage was after the surrender of the Confederacy. So Robert E. Lee surrendered the main Confederate Army on April 9th, 1865. There was still fighting going on through June. That's what Juneteenth is all about. Finally, the word reaching the far reaches of the South that the war was over. But I thought her reactions after, and it wasn't so much like, oh, what did Lee do? It was at first, did Robert E. Lee actually surrender? And then what's going to happen to us? What's it look like in Richmond and our property? And I was particularly struck by the relations with Union soldiers who are now commanding the area, and in particular, black soldiers. Black were often black ruffians, and she had a dimmer view of black soldiers than she did the white soldiers, but she had a dim view of Union soldiers. But the uncertainty as to what's going to happen to us after General Lee, who's exalted in the South, surrendered. And those passages right after the end of the war, I found very moving and very insightful.
Yeah. I mean, just to, so everyone knows, when the war was over, Emma and Rosina were devastated, right? They were very unhappy, but they accepted it, right? This happened, they accepted it. And then, so Rosina immediately understood what this was going to mean, right? She doesn't own these enslaved people anymore. And she just assumed that they would want to stay and continue to work in this tra-la-la family environment. And she immediately offered to pay them. Like, to her, that's what you have to do. She doesn't own them anymore. That's just a fact. She doesn't like it, but that's a fact. So she offered to pay them. And she and Emma both were shocked when the enslaved family was like, no, thank you, see ya. And within 3 weeks of the war being over, we're gone. They did not stay. They had no interest in staying in this place where they had been enslaved. They sort of left in dribs and drabs, and the whole family didn't all leave at once. But Emma and Rosina and the children, like the nephews and the niece, were like so startled. Why wouldn't they want to stay with us? We think of them as family. But of course, the enslaved people knew perfectly well they were not their family. They did not think of Emma and Rosina as family. And since they made other plans and they were able to leave. Now, of course, the problem with history and with the documentary record is that we don't know what happens to everybody. We can't know what happens to everybody. And so Cyrus and Sarah, the elders of this family, as I mentioned, sort of they leave and they exit history. We don't know what happened to them. Chances are good, if they did what most other formerly enslaved people did, chances are good that the first two things they did were that Cyrus and Sarah would try to get married legally as quickly as possible, which had not been allowed to them before the war. And chances are also good that those in the family who were not already literate, which some of them were, because Rosina and her had taught some of them to read and write, which was illegal, and she had done so, but that they would have made sure that everyone in the family who was old enough would be literate, would become literate, learn how to read and write. These are the two priorities that a lot of formerly enslaved families had. The other priority was just trying to reunite the family. But this family, because Rosina had never separated them, was actually relatively intact. And so they didn't have to do that as much. But we don't know. We don't know what happened to them. We don't know what last name they might have taken. They hadn't had one before as enslaved people. And so it's sort of a shame. But for Emma and Rosina, this means they have to work like they'd never had to work before. Now, I should say that neither of them sat around doing nothing while the enslaved people did the work, especially in small farms like Rosina's, where there were, there were between like 7 to 10 enslaved people at any given moment. The owners worked right along with them. So if you read Emma's diary, there are all kinds of mundane entries. They're fixing this. They're making dresses. They're making sleeves. They're fixing the piano. Like they're out in the fields with the enslaved people harvesting the strawberries. These are not women who just sat around and did nothing. But now they have to cook, for instance, for themselves. They have to do all the menu plan. They just have to do more, much more household labor. And both of them were exhausted all the time. You see this in the small period that the diary covers after the war. They're tired. They're looking around to try to hire somebody to do this work. Rosina was sort of sickly in the 19th century sense, and so she is getting more sickly. She's overwhelmed by the amount of household labor they have to do. And this is another huge change. And it's not unusual. The diary ends in May of 1865, which is, a little while after the war ends. And a lot of Confederate women, not just Emma Mordecai, a lot of Confederate women ended their wartime diaries then. And it's a huge change. It's a changing moment. And a lot of them were just too busy to keep diaries at that point because they had to do more work than they had to do. So, these were not happy campers when the war ended. We don't know. Emma and Rosina both actually lived for decades after the end of the Civil War. There is some evidence that Emma made donations to Confederate museums and memorials and the like. Diane Ashton had corresponded with the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and it does not seem that Emma appears anywhere on their membership lists, which they have in their archives. There are other Mordecai family members who do. Emma's not on that. We don't, that's all I know. That's all Diane or the archivist there know. But, it would be nice to think that by the time she died in 1906, she lived a very long life, almost the entire 19th century, from 1812 to 1906. It would be nice to think that she had changed many of her attitudes, but we don't actually know that. The record goes thinner after the war, even though she lived for many decades thereafter. And certainly she has relatives who did not change their attitudes, who got very involved in promoting the so-called lost cause. And we just don't know exactly. But Emma did live in the South the rest of her life. She moved around a little bit after the war. She became a teacher. She had to work for a living for the first time, really. She had lost a lot of her wealth in the enslaved people she no longer owned. And she lived in Georgia for a little while. She lived in North Carolina, but she always went back to Richmond. And when she passed away in 1906, she was living in a boarding house in Richmond. So she was a Southern woman through and through.
Before we turn to the questions, I've got one last one for you, and very relevant for the Jewish News Book Club. Are you working on anything else? Should we anticipate reviewing your book in the future, a new book?
Okay. Well, I hope so. So yes, I am actually. I was already working on a project when I decided to put it aside for a while and take up Diane Ashton's work. So I have a book that will be out next year around this time. It's called Jewish Women at Home in the World. And then there's a whole long subtitle, but what it's about is American Jewish women who traveled abroad after the Civil War through World War II, actually. So it covers several generations of American Jewish women who went abroad for sightseeing, for education, for work, for activism. They went literally all over the world. I mean, yes, a lot of them went to Europe, but many went to Latin America. The people went to Asia. They went to North Africa in particular. And there's a whole chapter on American Jewish women who went to pre-state Palestine during this period. And I'm interested in the way that their gender and their Jewish and their American identities interacted in these travels. And so the book is a lot of fun. It uses diaries and letters and postcards. I have some fantastic illustrations in that book. And so I really, I'm excited about it coming out next year. And as you can see, I, often write about American Jewish women's history, and this is just a dimension of that that has never been looked at before.
Okay, we're going to look forward to that. Questions from our audience. The first one, why did Emma's father allow the sons to marry Christians, but not the daughter, Emma?
Well, so Emma's father didn't have a whole lot to do with it. There were daughters who married non-Jewish men. So there are both, Emma had both brothers and sisters who married non-Jewish partners. This time period, starting fairly shortly after the American Revolution, ideas about marriage really changed, and so the idea, people already had not really had arranged marriages in the sense that we understand someone forcibly being dragged down the aisle, but there was this idea that you were looking for a companion in marriage, what's called companionate marriage, and it was really like young people made these decisions for themselves, and in fact, in the 1820s, 1830s, it was sort of widely understood that this decision, who to marry, was the most important decision a woman made for herself. Because, of course, it would presumably affect the entire shape of her future life, who her husband was, where they would live, what their class status would be. And so parents might have had opinions about who their children should marry, but they didn't really control the situation. It is true that Jacob Mordecai bemoaned it every time one of his children married out or converted, and there was at least one sister, Emma's older sister, half-sister Ellen, who was one of the people that Emma was living with until they packed up the home in 1864. Ellen waited to convert until after Jacob died, but she had already planned on it for quite a while at that point, and it's just, the parents did not control who people married. Something else I just want to point out about this, though, is that what this demonstrates, it's not just that Emma had siblings who married non-Jewish partners. It's that this was not a big deal in the wider society either, right? Intermarriage was not as verboten then as it actually would later become. The intermarriage rate was higher before the Civil War than it would be again until after World War II. Just there were fewer Jews in America, there were fewer people to marry. There's a demographic issue that is at play there, and they're all related to each other, which is also an issue. Like a lot of them are cousins and related to each other. First cousins, by the way, did marry during this period pretty generally. But Jews in the South especially, the intermarriage rate was higher in the South, in part because what mattered in the South was this binary of whether you were sort of black or white. And although Jews were not always accepted as white, they were not accepted as white as readily in the North, and they were not accepted as white during the mass migration of Eastern European Jews a little bit later. But in this period in the South, Jews were seen as white, and so that's what mattered. They were seen as white, and so if they're white, then you can marry them. Right? The religion wasn't seen as being as big a deal, and especially if somebody was willing to convert, usually the expectation is that the Jewish person would be the one to convert to the mainstream Christian religion, and not all of Emma's siblings who married non-Jewish partners converted, but many of them did, and all of them raised their children Christian. And so there was acceptance of this in the wider society, which also tells you something about, what mattered in this society was race. Like that was, and even though there's not a racial binary, it's not only black and white people, there were, for instance, Native Americans all over the South too, but a lot of them had been moved out forcibly on the horrific Trail of Tears in the 1830s. And so what was seen as mattering was racial identity. That's what mattered most. And in the South, in the antebellum South, Jews counted as white.
Another question. How did Emma rationalize the intrinsic physical and mental maltreatment of the slave with Jewish theology?
Well, this is a question that's not just a question about Jewish theology, it's a question about Christian theology as well. And in both the Jewish and the Christian communities, there were people who looked to the Bible and found support for slavery, and there were people who looked to the Bible and found support for abolition. So in the South, actually the most famous sort of pro-slavery sermon delivered by a rabbi in the Civil War era was actually delivered by a rabbi in New York. He wasn't even Southern. Right? There is, if you look, there is now the servitude, or is not the servitude in the Hebrew Bible has limitations on it, and there's all kinds of injunctions about treating your, servants fairly, and they can't stay enslaved forever, and it's not hereditary. There's differences between biblical slavery and the system as it developed in the U.S. and elsewhere, not just in the U.S. But there's still, you can rationalize slavery as a system by looking in the Bible. And so that was true for Christians and for Jews. And so I think someone like Emma didn't feel a need to rationalize anything. It's there, it's acceptable within her religious understanding. And so she didn't have to rationalize anything except that it was important to her as a good Jew to be a so-called good slave owner. And that was true for Rosina, who was Christian as well. And so, it's very foreign to a modern audience, and I'm certainly not here to justify it, but we need historians need to explain things, not necessarily to excuse them. And it's just not hard to find biblical and theological justification for slavery if you're looking for it. It is also not hard to find biblical and theological justification for not owning slaves and for abolition, but people will find what they want to find in religion and in texts like the Bible.
Still true today. One more here. How rare was it to be an educated Jewish woman in the South during the Civil War?
Okay, so like I said, there were about 25,000 Jews in the South during this period, and obviously something like half of them were women. Jewish women did tend to be somewhat better educated than other women around them. The comparison needs to be women of the same class status. That's what matters. But Jewish women in general tended to be somewhat better educated. The Mordecai family was renowned throughout the South for being particularly educated, including the women. And in fact, Jacob Mordecai, Emma's father, and his first wife Judith, and then his second wife Rebecca, and that's Emma's mother, and many of Emma's older siblings actually ran a school for girls in Warrenton, North Carolina, which is in North Carolina near the Virginia border. And this school was renowned throughout the South for being academically rigorous. So it was a school for young ladies, not Jewish young ladies. You couldn't make a living having a Jewish girls' school. There weren't enough Jewish girls. It was a school for young ladies of, let's say, middling to upper class, probably not the most elite girls went from the most elite families went there. And the idea was that they would get a real education there. Now that doesn't look quite the same as it might look today, but the Mordecai family was just known for being particularly well educated. So they're special in that way, and they educated actually like a generation of young upper middle class Southern white women who wrote letters and stayed in touch with the family, felt very close to various of the Mordecais. When Jacob Mordecai died in 1838, letters from all over the South from people young women who had gone to that school poured in as condolence letters. This was a known family, but they're not unique in the sense that there were other educated Jewish women. So just as an example, I mentioned the Civil War diaries of a few other Jewish women. The young woman Clara Solomon, who lived in New Orleans, she was a teenager, but she was in school. She went to school every day. That's what she was doing. She was in high school when the war broke out. Right, her schooling was, actually continued during the war, and her older sister was a teacher in the public schools in New Orleans. So that's an educated family. Caroline Cohen, who kept a diary who lived in Columbia, South Carolina, in Charleston, and then in Columbia, South Carolina, also very educated. And you can see it in their diaries. There's references to works of literature and to history, and they write very well. Phoebe Pember, who worked in Yates, who worked as a nurse and ran a hospital in Richmond, right? Also educated. So, of course, these are examples, and there could well have been uneducated people, But the Southern Jews tended to be doing pretty well economically. They weren't all huge slave owners, but they tended to do relatively well, even if they just had small stores. And so their children tended to be pretty well educated. So Emma's not really unique in that sense. Where she is unique is that she had a much better than usual Jewish education. Her father, Jacob, was known as one of the most Jewish educated people in the South. He had grown up in Philadelphia, which had a much larger Jewish community, and when he died in 1838, he bequeathed to one of his children. He had the biggest, or it's actually to the Richmond Jewish community. He had the biggest Jewish library of books in the South. It was 19. He owned 19 Jewish books, and that was a big deal. And he actually, I misspoke. He didn't leave them to his family. He left them to the synagogue in Richmond. And so this was a family. He actually could read Hebrew. It's very unlikely that Emma could read Hebrew, but it's also most Jews in the United States in the antebellum period couldn't read Hebrew. So that's not so unusual. So education was a key value. It has traditionally been a key value in Judaism, and that was true in the Southern Jewish community, and particularly in the Mordecai family.
One last question, then. As a professor, when you teach elements of the Civil War or the Civil War, are students still interested? Is it still relevant for today?
Okay, so I'm not a Civil War historian per se. I actually had to, in order to work on this book, I had to very quickly catch up on all the latest scholarship on the Civil War. So, of course, as someone who teaches American and women's history, I know about the Civil War, but now I know much more in a more recent way. But I'm not, the time period I usually write about is later than that. It's after the Civil War. The students, yeah, everybody's interested in the Civil War. Like there's a huge mass interest. In fact, I would tell you that many of my colleagues sort of bemoan how interested people are in the Civil War to the exclusion of almost anything else except maybe World War II. If you ask many of our students what classes they would want to take all the time, they would be perfectly happy to go through college and take only classes on the Civil War and World War II, which is a problem, actually. Yeah. So it remains very salient, and the Civil War in general remains extremely salient to American, I don't want to say, I don't want to get very political, but let's just say to American society, culture, and politics today. People are constantly referencing the Civil War. They're referencing Civil War symbols from the Confederacy in particular. These are not dead issues. So I think there remains a lot of interest. One thing that I will say that's kind of interesting is that when you think about American women's history overall, and this came up actually, my colleague and I, at Rowan, we used to have a class that was just called Women in American History, and we somehow were supposed to do the whole thing in one semester, which is kind of crazy. So a number of years ago, my colleague and I decided to split it. We would have women in early American history and women in modern American history. And then the question arose, where is the split? It's not so simple, because if you're doing African American history and teaching a class about that, then obviously the Civil War and Reconstruction, that's a huge turning point, right? Slavery ends. It is an obvious and the sort of correct thing to do to divide African American history 1 and 2 at the Civil War. But that's not true for women's history. There are changes, certainly, and there are wartime exigency changes, but actually the major changes for women really take place later. And so we split our class in the 1890s when, for a variety of reasons, there's much more, there are big changes in the legal status of women, in their educational and their professional opportunities, and then eventually a few decades later with the right to vote. And so it's interesting that the Civil War does not occupy quite the same central position in women's history as it does in all of American history or in African American history. And it just demonstrates that when you look at history through the lens of something like gender, you see all kinds of things that you didn't necessarily see before. And this is a good example of that.
Well, we're out of questions, but I do want to say, one, that was brilliant. Thank you so much for speaking to us. And I also want to, if you don't mind, of course, plug your book. I've written quite a bit, I've written a little bit on the Civil War, but I've read quite a bit. That's how I got into this business as a kid, reading Civil War history. And this is one of the best books that I've read. I really appreciate the fact that the prose is so readable. Readable might be a, generic term, but it is. It's highly readable. It's a great book. Thank you for being with us today. Really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.
And then I'm going to end with a plug because I've got the mic. So we are now accepting pre-orders until October 31st, and you can get free shipping on A Taste of Tradition, Recipes and Food Memories from Jewish Detroit. We asked our readers at the Jewish News to share their favorite Jewish recipes, and they delivered. This project turned out to be bigger, warmer, and more delicious, I might add, than we ever imagined. More than 70 recipes came in from across the community, and the rest is a one-of-a-kind collection that celebrates foods, family traditions, and what makes Jewish Detroit so special. And I will add, we made this book a little bit different. It's going to be a hardcover, but we asked not only for recipes, but for photos of the recipe makers and the backstory. Where did this recipe come from? And I also want to thank Ashley Watkins, our JN Operations Manager, and Elizabeth King for helping put this together. They're handling the Zoom and gave me the note to make sure I try not to mispronounce Emma Mordecai again. And they've done all the back work on this to make this Zoom successful. So thanks again for today's author, Melissa Klapper. And most of all, thanks to you, the stalwart members of the Jewish News Book Club, for being with us today. And we hope to see you all again on January 25th. The next event will be a live event at Schuler Books on Orchard Way in West Bloomfield. So thanks again to everyone, and enjoy the rest of your Sunday.